Hello and welcome back. In this video we're going to look at a really impressive technique that allows us to change our perspective and also the viewpoint from which the image was taken after the shot. And if you thought that was impossible, have a look at this. We can change the perspective and the camera position, particularly in wide-angle camera shots where things in the distance appear to be a bit diminished and we want to retain that sense of grandeur in an image. So let's have a look at how we do this. Now, to demonstrate this technique, I've got three different images all taken in Iceland, and this first one was taken in an area called Krafla in northeast Iceland. And it was a very impressive area because it was an area where there was a volcanic eruption that spanned over 20 years, and it was characterized by slow-flowing lava that spread like mud over the landscape. And it was very difficult to get a perspective on this because it was largely flat areas of rather dark grey lava fields, but there were occasional areas where there was mineral deposits, as you can see here. And what I wanted to photograph was the extent and the vastness of this area, but with the wide-angle lens that I was using, which was a 16mm lens, objects in the far distance tend to look diminished, whereas the objects in the foreground obviously are emphasized. And while the foreground looked pretty good, the background just didn't really convey the perspective. So I wanted to amend that, and I couldn't get the camera any higher in the position I was in to take this photograph, so we're going to resort to a technique. And the first thing we're going to do is we're going to create a copy of our background layer and convert it to a smart object. And I'm going to ignore the layers I've already created here, and I'll just demonstrate how we create the smart object. So the simplest method to create a copy of our background layer is to use the keystroke Control J, which I will do. And you'll see now that I've created a background copy layer, and you can relabel that if you like, it doesn't really matter. And what we do then is we just right mouse click and we say with the menu convert to smart object. And the reason why we convert this to a smart object is that it allows us to re-edit any of the filters we apply to this layer after we've accepted the settings, because often you'll want to go back and make some further adjustments. And if it's not a smart object, it's not going to allow you to do that. You'll have to delete it and start again. Now, it takes a little while to convert this to a smart object, and once done so, it will appear on the bottom here with a little symbol that indicates that it's a smart object. You'll see here, smart object, that little symbol. Now, having created our smart object, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to apply this special filter to change the perspective and viewpoint. And with the smart object layer selected, we go up to the edit menu and come down to perspective warp. And if you're working on a much older version of Photoshop, you may not have this available, so it's a good reason to upgrade to the latest version. Bearing in mind that in the very latest version at the time of this video, which was 22.3.1, there is a slight bug in the perspective warp tool. So if you're using 22.3.0 or the version that will come after this that will have this bug fixed, you won't have a problem. So we just select a perspective warp. So far we don't see anything. And how this tool works is we draw a series of boxes on the image where we want to apply the warping. And this tool was originally designed to allow people to correct perspective in things like buildings and so forth. But in this instance, we can use it to recompose the image. And the first thing that happens is we get a little toolbar at the top here that gives us some options, and the first one allows us to select elements of the layout. And what we do is with this tool, you'll see it's converted to a little box with a funny symbol. We're going to draw a series of boxes around the image. Now, I like to draw the box outside the image area because it allows me to do some tweaking and to a little bit of cropping. Firstly, the bottom part of this image I want to reduce, and so I've drawn a box here, and then we draw another series of boxes for the areas that we also want to adjust. And to make this work, you need to move the cursor as close to the existing little white box as you can while still retaining that little funny shaped icon. And then you draw another box, and in this case this is the area I want to adjust. I release that, and you'll see that it links to the existing box. And finally, I'm going to draw another box above that because I want to reduce the effect of the sky, and so I draw another box here, and you'll see once I've released that, I've got a series of interconnected boxes, and now I can proceed to do the perspective warping. And once we've drawn all the boxes we want, we go from the layout box to the warp box, and you'll see once you click that it will change to just showing us the little points that we want to change. Now what I want to do is I want to bring this part of the outcrop down so that I can see a little bit more of this area in the distance, and also to enhance the height of these mountains. So the first thing I'm going to do is drag this bottom part of the image downwards, and you'll see that as I drag each corner down, it does slightly affect the perspective of the image, and it's stretched this bottom part of the image. Now I don't really want that, so what I'm going to do now is drag the next part of the image down, and you'll see that if I move that in and out, you'll see that it's exposing the underlying layer. So we just need to be careful that we keep that covering all of the image area. So I'm now compressing this bottom part of the image downwards, and again being careful to make sure that I keep the image within the bounds. And now you'll see that the middle part of the image has been stretched. I don't want that either, so I'm going to drag the next line down, and I'm going to bring this down a little. Now you need to bring down both sides so that you then start to see the effect. Now what's happened now is that this part of the image has been compressed. I've pulled part of the image off the bottom of the image, and that doesn't bother me because I wasn't too fussed about that anyway. So we'll just adjust that, and now I have a little bit of the sky opened up. Now you'll see here that now the top image has revealed part of the image below, so I now want to enhance that top part of the image, and I don't mind losing a little bit of the sky because that's not really a problem for me. But you'll see now that once I do that the mountains have started to be drawn upwards. Now at this point I'm pretty happy with it, so I'm now going to just accept that and click on the little tick box up here in the toolbar, and that will render that image as the smart object. And now we can compare that with the original layer by just turning that off and on, and you'll see there's a dramatic change. The sky has been stretched up, and in particular we're now starting to see a little more of this background area being revealed. I'll just turn that off once more. Whereas this was all compressed and flat, and this outcrop or this mountain in the medium distance was very diminished, and this was dominant. Now by adjusting this image, I've brought this part down. It's as if I've raised my whole camera position, and I'm getting now a better perspective on what's in the distance. And now I can then proceed to make some further tweaks to the image. Now I'll turn that layer off, and we'll go back to the one that I prepared earlier, because we've now got what I worked on, which is going to be slightly different from the way I just did it. But essentially we've got the same thing. I've enhanced this mountain in the distance, I've reduced the amount of sky, and it's now as if we're standing another half a metre or a metre taller, and we can see down on the landscape. And this is a technique that you might use with your wide angle lens work, is to maybe use a slightly higher camera viewpoint and angle it down slightly to enhance the distant objects. But we can do this in Photoshop. So having done that, I'm pretty happy with that layout, and then I would subsequently go and apply some other filtration to it, and I've used a couple of Nik filters here, and we'll turn those on. And what happens with the smart objects, when you apply a filter to a smart object and then you turn it off and make some further adjustments to another filter, it then goes back in and reapplies the filters, so that if you've made some changes, for instance to the perspective here, and then applied something like Nik color effects or one of the other filters, it will go and re-render those filters after you've made your perspective changes. Now I could go back in and readjust my perspective warp if I wasn't totally happy with it, so let's just see how that works. So I want to change my perspective warp again, and I really want to just make some slight adjustments. I'm just waiting for the other filters to finish rendering, and it's just about done. And this is the only drawback with using smart objects, is that every time you make a change, all of the filters that are applied to that smart object have to be reapplied. But that's a very minor price to pay. So now that we've just about got all of our filters reapplied, I'm going to go back in and make this perspective warp adjustment and reapply it. Here we go. So they're all applied now. All I need to do is double click on the word perspective warp, and it takes me back into the filter, and here's the grid that I applied with my other version of it. And you can see here, well, I can make some further adjustments if I want to, and if I choose to do that, then I just need to re-tick the box and it reapplies the filter. Now in this case I've not made any changes, so we're fine, and it's just going to now reapply all of my background filters. And the emphasis here is to try and give us a sense of the perspective in the image, and so I've used a couple of the Nik filters to emphasize the color and texture in these rocks in the foreground, and your choices might be a little bit different, but that's what works for me. Okay, so we've reapplied all those filters after making any adjustments we wanted to do with the perspective warp, and so then we can go on to finish off the image. Now the rest of the image looks pretty good, but there's a few issues in the sky. Now this was the original sky, but the filters that I've used and the stretching has given me a little bit of an odd effect in the sky, and then I've revealed a little bit of maybe a bit of sensor dust here. So I could go back in and re-edit my background image by just double clicking on that and using the clone tool to patch those things out. But overall the sky is a little bit messy, and I've decided what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a sky replacement, and I've replaced it with a simpler sky because I didn't want the emphasis on the sky. And you'll see elsewhere a video on how to replace the sky, but it is just a simple process. Let's just have a look at it. With my smart object layer completed here, and with that layer selected, I just go up to Edit, Sky Replacement, and this opens up a new menu box, and you've got some options here to replace the sky. Now with the later versions of Photoshop, it comes with a whole lot of preset skies, but I think it's much better if you use your own skies. In this instance I've used one of the skies that was provided, I think, within Photoshop, or did I use my own? I think I used my own, but you've got a range of choices here to select from. Once you've selected that, you can then apply some little bits of tweakage with this, and the thing is that with this it works so beautifully well that it's a much quicker way than trying to do it yourself. Now I've now created a different sky, and you'll see here that within this group it's given me a new sky with a mask. It's given me some changes to the foreground, and it's also given me a little bit of an adjustment to the foreground color. And the beauty of this is, if you're not totally happy with the replacement of the sky, you can easily adjust each of those individual layers, or you can just change the opacity of the layer on its own. This is the one that I don't like. That's one that I chose just now, and this is my one that I worked with earlier, and you'll see that I've reduced the opacity a bit because I didn't want it to be too dominant, but it does a very good job of selecting the horizon line and replacing it with the sky of your choice. So having replaced the sky, I've then made some further adjustments, which is basically a series of curves and hue saturation adjustment layers just to enhance a few different areas of the image. So let's just have a quick look at how all of those work. Firstly, that middle distance area here was a little bit dark for my preference, so I just lightened that a little bit and applied a mask to that, and I'll just hold down Alt and click on the mask to show the overlay. Very scientifically applied mask. I've just painted that in with a brush, and just simply to lighten those areas that I thought were losing a little bit of detail. And then I've applied a little bit more color in a couple of areas just to enhance that very slightly. Again, a little bit more color in this area that I thought was just lacking a little bit of separation from the background. Very subtle. and then I have darkened that whole area of sky just a little bit to give us a little bit more of a sense of distance, lightened this foreground fractionally more, and maybe even added a bit of contrast, perhaps a little bit too much. We can just reduce that a little bit and just make it not quite as aggressive, and then finally applied a slight vignette to the image, and all of those were just contained in a group that I created. And that's the essential way that we work with the perspective adjustment. We'll have a look at another couple of images just to quickly visit a couple of different options. So now we've seen how the basic principle works. Let's look at a couple of other ones that I worked on earlier. This one is also in Iceland on the south coast, a very famous waterfall, and if we just look at it, I've got a little bit too much foreground here and we've lost a little bit of the emphasis of the background. Again, taken with a wide angle lens, you can see here that there's a horde of people trying to walk around behind the waterfall, so you do get a little bit of a sense of scale, but we can improve that by applying a little bit of stretch to the image just to re-emphasize the height of the waterfall. And you'll see here that I've also added a little bit of extra color and adjusted those to just emphasize things a little more, and bring out some of the detail in these rocks. It's important, if you're trying to give a sense of perspective, that you do apply some adjustments to sharpen up some of the areas and de-emphasize others. Now in this one it was a very overcast day, so I used a sky replacement, again dropping the opacity right back to just give a little bit of a sense of something in the sky, because otherwise it was just a bland adjustment. And then we just finished off with a few little further adjustments. Again, a little bit of hue saturation. Let's just see what they are. So the hue and saturation, I actually just took a little bit of the color out of the green areas. It was getting a little bit too vibrant, so I took a little bit out of that, and a little bit of hue and saturation somewhere. Oh, that's right, the red jackets on these people here were just a little bit too red, so I just took those red areas out. Let's just zoom back a little bit. So we reduced the area and just a little bit of a subtle vignette, and the image is finished. But the difference between the before and after gives us a much stronger sense of the power and size of the waterfall using that same perspective warp. And the last one I'm going to show you is also from Iceland on the south coast, and this was an area where these rock spires were quite dramatic, but we didn't have quite the emphasis in the image that I processed. And if I just do this, I just simply did the perspective warp on this layer and just stretch them up a little bit. So let's just double click on perspective warp and go in, and all I've done here is draw a rectangle around those parts of the image that I wanted to stretch, and I've just pulled them up a little bit to give a little more emphasis on the spires, but leave the foreground as it was. So with that left as is, we've gone in and reapplied that, and then just a little bit of final adjustment, some lightening and darkening selectively to give a little bit more definition on this rock spire and on the foreground, and a little bit of a slight vignette, and the image is complete. So that's it for perspective warp. So just to summarize what we've looked at in this video, using the perspective warp tool, we can replace some of the perspective that's been lost in using a wide angle lens or a viewpoint that doesn't quite give us the effect we want. Some people might say that this is cheating, but what we're trying to do is we're trying to represent our impression of what we've seen in the photograph, and using this perspective warp tool we can then selectively adjust the image to give it the effect that we saw at the time. I hope this has been useful, and I look forward to seeing you again soon.